Hi everyone, welcome back to Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. We're going to continue our study of colonial encounters in Asia, Africa, and Oceania with under European rule. And our focus, or we'll start with our focus on cooperation and rebellion. So some groups and individuals cooperated willingly with their new masters. Employment in the armed forces, for example, the elite often kept much of their status and privileges. The governments and missionaries promoted European education. The growth of a small class with Western education, and governments relied on them increasingly over time. But there are periodic rebellions. For example, the Indian Rebellion, 1857 to 1858, was based on a series of grievances. The Indian Rebellion began as a mutiny among Indian troops, and rebel leaders advocated a revival of the Mughal Empire. And there's a widened India's racial divide. The British were less tolerant of the natives, and it led the British government to assume direct control over India. All right, let's look at colonial empires with a difference. So in the new colonial empires, race was a prominent point distinguishing rulers from the ruled. Racism was especially pronounced in areas with a large number of European settlers, for example, South Africa. Colonial states imposed deep changes in people's daily lives, and colonizers were fascinated with counting and classifying their new subjects. In India, they appropriated an idealized caste system, and in Africa, they identified or invented distinct quote-unquote tribes. And gender also played a role. Colonizers took pride in active masculinity, and they defined the colonized as soft, passive, and feminine. And they linked gender ideology and racial prejudice in support of colonial rule. And European women were seen as emblems of civilization. Some colonized peoples, for example, the Sikhs, Gurkhas, Khamba, and Hausas, were gendered as masculine or martial races and recruited into security forces. Colonial policies contradicted European core values and practices at home. Colonies were essentially dictatorships, and they were the antithesis of quote-unquote national independence. Racial classifications were against Christian and Enlightenment ideas of human equality, and many colonizers were against spreading quote-unquote modernization to the colonies. In time, the visible contradictions in European behavior helped undermine the foundations of colonial rule. All right, European master and Indian servants. This image, dating to 1812, shows a young European gentleman attended by multiple servants in colonial India. It illustrates the exalted status available to quite ordinary Europeans in a colonial setting, as well as the sharp racial divide separating Europeans and Indians. How are European attitudes toward Indians, as seen in this image, similar to the attitudes in South Africa? Well, in most colonies that had a large European settler population, the expression of racial distinctions was much more pronounced than in places such as Nigeria, which had few permanently settled whites. The most extreme case was South Africa, where a large European population and the widespread use of African labor in mines and industries brought Africans and Europeans into closer, more prolonged contact than elsewhere. The racial fears that were aroused resulted in extraordinary efforts to establish race as a legal, not just a customary, feature of South African society. And this racial system provided for separate homelands, educational systems, residential areas, public facilities, and much more. And what was eventually known as apartheid. South African whites attempted the impossible task of creating an industrializing economy based on cheap African labor, while limiting African social and political integration in every conceivable fashion. And that concludes our study of under European rule. I will see you guys next time.